So I'm really happy to be here. So what I'm going to share with you today is a bit of my research on leadership. And my background is in psychology. So I took a lot of classes. Even though my PhD was at Haas, I took a lot of classes at Tolman, which is pretty far from Haas, especially if you're very pregnant. So during my 5 years of my PhD, I had 2 children. And there was one point where I had back-to-back classes at Tolman, and then I had to go to Haas immediately for the next class. And I was, by then, very, very pregnant. And all my classmates were like rushing past me to get to Haas. And I'd be huffing and puffing. Did you know it's uphill the whole way? I don't know if you've noticed, but it is. Anyway, but the sunshine made up for everything. Now I'm here with no sunshine. So yes, my background is in psychology, and in psychology there's about 100 years of research on leadership. And mostly, being psychologists, we focus on the interpersonal aspect of leadership. And an underlying question in the leadership research has been, are leaders born or made? So are leaders born with something special that makes them leaders, or do they develop along the way? So let me just take a show of hands here. How many of you think leaders are born? And how many of you think leaders are made? Okay. So nobody raised their hand for leaders are born. However, there is some relevance. So you are correct in that most of the research now says leaders are developed along the way. There are tons of things we can do to develop leaders. But what you're born with is still relevant because it tells you your comfort zone. It tells you your strengths and weaknesses. So you need to manage that. If you don't manage it, then you're not going to develop as far as you can. But anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about reframing leadership. So that's an old question. Reframing leadership in the sense of all of that research, most of that 100 years of research, has looked at leadership from the perspective of the leader. So it's the idea that the leader is in control. So all we need to do is tell the leader what to do. They'll be in control. They can intentionally influence their followers. And I don't use follower in the pejorative sense. That's just what we use as the opposite of leader. So they intentionally influence their followers. But I'm building on the research of a couple of people that aren't that well known. James Mindel, Robert Lord. They did research from a different perspective. So instead of looking at it from the leader is in control, what about the perspective of the follower? The other people that are looking at the leader. What influence do they have on how effective the leader can be? And so what you end up discovering when you start looking at other people's perceptions of the leader is that leaders can actually unintentionally influence people in certain ways. And so I look at this from different angles. There's a gender angle, there's a culture, cross-cultural angle, and there's a nonverbal behavior angle. And so the research I did when I was at Berkeley was on the nonverbal behavior. And the reason I got interested in nonverbal behavior is because when I worked at the Boston Consulting Group in Asia Pacific, I was sort of in charge of training and development for our 10 offices in Asia Pacific. And we were very concerned about teaching our consultants what we called leadership presence. You can kind of guess what that means. These are young consultants. They need to go in and talk to CEOs who are much older than them and industry experts. And these young consultants need to go in and have that presence and show that confidence. And so let me see if you can guess what I had to teach them. So in terms of posture, do you think I was teaching them to stand up straight or to kind of relax? Which one? Straight. Okay. In terms of gestures, was it small gestures or was it broad gestures? Yep. In terms of eye contact, was it indirect eye contact or direct eye contact? And in terms of voice, was it kind of uncertain or was it confident? Yeah. So this is stuff that we all know. This is what I call, I've called it different things. It's leader-like demeanor, a confident demeanor, but it's the nonverbal. It's not about what you're saying. It's about the way you're standing, the way you're moving, the way you're looking at people. So we all know that this is great, this is wonderful, this is what we teach people. So my research was, are there any situations where this might be bad? Where you shouldn't use this leader-like, confident demeanor. And in particular, I was interested in how this was perceived by followers. And so what I looked at was a joint decision-making task, which happens a lot in consulting. So a lot of my research is informed by my work experience. So in consulting, you have a team leader, and then you've got team members who are doing all the research, all the data, and you've got to put it all together for the client. And so as one of the senior people told me at BCG, he said, I want my team members to be my sparring partners. I want them to argue with me. When I say, we're going to do this for the client, they have the data. They're the ones who looked it up. They're the ones who did the research. So I want them to say, no, this is what makes sense. But oftentimes they didn't get those sparring partners. And so that was part of what motivated me to look at this. So let me tell you about one of the studies I ran while I was at Berkeley. This is Cliff. He was an MBA student at Haas in November 2007. Does anyone here know Cliff? Okay, well, you can tell him that I showed his video. So Cliff was great. I can't even remember how I found Cliff. I didn't know any actors, and I needed someone to participate in this experiment to play the supervisor. And all the participants in these experiments are undergraduates. So I thought, well, to make it as realistic as possible, I have to get a graduate student, preferably an MBA. They'll kind of be able to see this person as their supervisor. And so the exercise was, it was based on a published sort of business simulation from Kellogg. It was a dispute resolution kind of thing. But so it was a business simulation where you have, the task is you're hiring a CFO from 3 different candidates. And so you've got shared information, which is the CVs of the 3 candidates, but you've also got confidential information. So stuff that you supposedly collected through your sources, stuff about their working style, their personality, their reputation, that sort of stuff. So the 2 people, you've got the subordinate who has their confidential information, you've got the supervisor who has their confidential information. And so they have to debate and decide on who out of those 3 candidates they should choose. So the way it works is, before they even interact, each person looks at their information, and the participant, the undergraduate who is playing the subordinate, fills out a form that says which of the 3 people they choose. Now, if they happen to choose the same person as Cliff, then we abort the experiment right there. But that rarely happens. That happened, I think, in less than 5% of the times, because out of those 3 candidates, there's one that is clearly not suitable for the job. Clearly not suitable, based on the confidential information. And that's the person that Cliff always chooses. So the question is, once they get into this conversation about who we should choose, how much does this subordinate speak up? How much do they argue back? How much do they share their confidential information? And how likely are they to agree with Cliff at the end? And so I had 2 conditions. One where Cliff used this great leader-like demeanor that we all talked about, and the other where he doesn't. So I will quickly play you 1 minute of each of these videos so you can see. Tell me if you can see the difference. He's not an actor, and I think he did a great job.
Hi there, my name's Cliff. I understand that we'll be working on a couple of tasks together today. The first of which will be a decision-making task, and the second of which will be a face-to-face task. So starting with the decision-making task, which is choosing a new CFO for PB Technologies. So I took some time to look through the resumes of Suzanne, Kristen, and Nancy, and they're all really strong candidates, but I do have what I think is a clear strongest candidate from the group. And what I'd like to do is take you through my thought process on that one, and then I'd be really curious to hear your feedback on that and your opinion. So I started with Kristen. Hi, I'm Cliff. So I guess we're going to be working on 2 tasks today. There's this decision-making task that we're going to do together, and then we're going to meet and do another task face-to-face. So our first task is to decide on a new CFO. So I looked at the candidates, and I think they're all really good. And I guess what I like to do is just kind of go through like my thought process for this, and then would be really curious to hear your perspective, because I really think they're really close. So I started with Kristen, and she's got a lot of really impressive traits and a lot of really impressive experience, but I don't like that she has not worked for the company. So I put her aside, but that was my reaction.
Okay, so you kind of got a sense for the difference there. Was it version A or version B where he was using the leader-like demeanor? A. So I thought he did a great job. He wasn't actually an actor. I reran the study here in the UK with a professional actor. And we basically found the same results, which was that when the supervisor is using that leader-like demeanor, what happens is the subordinate speaks less, shares their information less, and is more likely to agree with the supervisor at the end of the discussion. And because the supervisor is always choosing the least appropriate candidate, it ends up with a poor decision. So in this case, a leader-like demeanor was not effective. But the reason was because the leader was perceived as being more competent and knowledgeable. So this is just an example of what I'm talking about, where perception, it's about, you have to think about how people are perceiving you when you're a leader. You may think, I'm in control of this conversation, but in fact, the nonverbal demeanor, which we often don't think about what we're using, especially if you're in a conversation with a subordinate, your nonverbal demeanor is communicating to this person and is affecting the ultimate performance of the task. So the idea is simply the leader is not in as much control as the leader sometimes thinks. But so if we go beyond perceptions of followers, there are other people whose perceptions matter as well. For example, recruiters who are hiring or bosses who are promoting people. And other people's perceptions are a particular problem for female leaders. So this is Carly Fiorina, who was the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, and of course Hillary Clinton. I don't know why they have the same haircut. But so there's been a series of studies on female leaders. And the fact that, this whole thing about appearing leader-like. So my previous study was about, what is a situation in which this leader-like demeanor is bad? Well, here is another situation in which it is not as effective as we all claim it should be. Which is when you're a woman trying to take on that leader-like demeanor. In fact, Linda Carly did this study that found women who use that leader-like demeanor that we just defined were considered less likable and were also less influential. They were less able to influence others, particularly when their audience was male. And in fact, what these women had to do was they had to combine this leader-like demeanor with a bit of warmth, with a bit of smiling. And that allowed them to be more influential. Men were not affected. They could just simply use the leader-like demeanor and it didn't matter. So why is perception so important to leadership? Why does it matter so much? And why, this whole thing about being perceived, why can men use the leader-like demeanor and women can't to the same effect? To understand this, we need to understand cognitive psychology and the theory of categorization, which was developed by Eleanor Roche. Oh, sorry. The headline here is Women Who Are Assertive Are Considered Less Likable, and I'll say a bit more about that. So Eleanor Roche developed this theory of categorization. In fact, she personally taught me the theory of categorization because she teaches at Berkeley. This is great. This was my first year of my PhD, and I was in Eleanor Roche's class, and she was teaching about categorization, and we had all these readings, and I was like, well, that's funny. The last name of the person who wrote these articles is, oh, okay. So that's the cool thing about studying at Berkeley. And at Haas, Barry Staw, he's like a rock star among academics in organizational behavior, and he was on my dissertation committee. So I can say to my colleagues at the LSE, well, Barry Staw, he was on my dissertation committee, we're like this. But yeah, so that's really the great thing about studying at Berkeley. So her theory of categorization says that while some categories are clear, so for example, square-shaped objects, that's a pretty clear category. You know if something belongs or doesn't belong, because there is a critical attribute that everything has to match, a square-shaped object. Most categories are what she calls fuzzy categories. Yes, that is a technical term. A fuzzy category is something where you don't have a critical attribute that everything has to match. And in fact, that's what leadership is. Leadership is a fuzzy category. And Robert Lord did a study to examine this. So he looked at 11 categories of leaders. I'm only showing you a few there. Business leader, religious, military, there's sports, there's political, all sorts of leaders. So 11 categories, and then he looked at a list of attributes, about 60-something attributes. Things like honest, aggressive, decisive, strong, unemotional. The only one that came close, so there was no single attribute that, and the way he did this was he surveyed a whole bunch of people and said, what attributes match these different types of leaders. So there was no single attribute that cut across all 11 categories. The only one that came close was intelligent. And that was considered a relevant attribute for 10 out of 11 categories. I don't know which the 11th was, but so leadership is a fuzzy category. And when you have a fuzzy category, the way people deal with this is they develop what's called a mental prototype, which is an abstract composite of the most representative attributes. And so they have this kind of prototype in their head, and then when they see a real live leader, they go, okay, how well does this person match the prototype in my head? And so if you think about it, if leadership is a fuzzy category, and this is how we determine if someone is a good leader, that's why all of this bias can kind of creep in. So Virginia Shine actually did a series of studies on what this prototype is, this leadership prototype. And she ended up, after she had done all her studies, her series of studies ended up being called Think Manager, Think Male. Because what she found was that the prototype, the leader prototype most people have in their heads, much more closely matches the prototypical male than the prototypical female. And so this is the challenge that female leaders face. We have these gender stereotypes, and these gender stereotypes come from, caveman days, when the man was out there, the men were out there killing the woolly mammoth or whatever, and the women were back at the cave taking care of the children, and so the women were communal. They had to take care of the family. And the men had to be assertive, strong, decisive. You have to be when it's a life or death situation. But we're not in caveman days anymore. And these stereotypes still linger, and they still affect leaders. So one of my advisors actually did a study, I think he might have done it with Berkeley MBAs, where he took a Harvard Business School case about a Silicon Valley entrepreneur named Heidi Roizen, a woman who was very agentic, very assertive, very outspoken, so very much the male stereotype. And he got permission from Harvard to change the name Heidi to Howard. So half of the MBA students got Heidi, and half of them got Howard. Everything else was exactly the same. It was just the first name that was changed. So they were told to read this case and then answer some questions about this person. Heidi and Howard were rated equally on competence, equally on effectiveness, but nobody liked Heidi, and nobody wanted to hire her. So this is the problem with the fact that, leadership is a fuzzy category. And so we develop these mental prototypes, and oftentimes these prototypes are male-ish. And so we end up with this bias. So essentially, my message here is that a leader's success is not completely in their control. You really have to think about the perceptions of others. And so the last point that I'll finish on is just this idea that you need to be aware. You need to be aware of the way you perceive others and the way that others perceive you. And so what I've put up here is if you just do a Google search for implicit association test or IAT Harvard, there's this test. Has anyone heard of this? The IAT? No? Okay, so it's something that psychologists at Harvard put together, and they love for people to go on the website and just take the test. It measures your implicit bias. And you can measure it for a whole bunch of different things. You can measure gender bias, you can measure age bias, you can measure racial bias, all of that. And it's the way the test goes, it's about matching words to, so the gender bias one, there are words that are female names and male names, and then there are words related to home and words related to work. And so the more gender biased you are, the more quickly you would associate male names with work and female names with home, rather than vice versa. Now the thing is, when you take this test, don't get too depressed. Because, so I live my life counter-stereotypically. My husband stays at home full-time and takes care of our 2 children. And I'm the one who works. And I thought, great, I'll take the gender bias test. I'm sure I'll score well. I was moderately biased towards women staying at home and men going to work. I was like, what, how is that possible? And I think it's because of the society that we live in. If you look at my daughters, when they were growing up, before they started going to school, you know how you get these toys like with a big duck and little ducks? And so they talk about the baby ducks and the daddy duck. Because to them, daddy is who takes care of the kids. Once they started going to school, that changed. It became the baby ducks and the mummy duck. So we can't ignore the society that we live in. It has a very strong influence on us, even if we live counter-stereotypically. But so really, awareness is the first step. And then being aware also of how others perceive you. And this is from a Robert Burns poem. The power that you get if you can see the way others see us. But awareness is only the first step, and there's a lot more I could say, but my time is up. This is sort of my next stream that I'm interested in, is female leaders and what they can do to kind of overcome these biases. And part of it really is realizing that people have they have these prototypes, they have these expectations. So perhaps the next step is to try to help manage those expectations. It's not just about women being accepted in the workplace, it's about men being accepted at home. My children's school, even though my husband is the one who takes care of them full time, picks them up from work every day, they still call me when, like, my daughter needed some sports shoes or something, and they called me and said, can you bring them into school? I'm like, no, but you could call my husband and he could bring them in. So we've got to accept both. But anyway, so that's sort of going on to my next stream of research that I'm really excited about. We have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has any questions. Yes?
Connson, have you
there's a microphone right there.
Oh, thank you. Connson, have you looked at this across cultures? Does the same thing work, say, for an Asian individual?
So you mean the leader-like demeanor?
Yeah, and the perceptions.
Yes.
Are there cultural differences, or is this more of a Anglo-Western U.S.-centric?
So what I'll
outcomes?
say about the cultural differences is that it's relative between the person who has power and the person who doesn't have power. So what you'll find in different cultures, there's the same sort of, the person who has power will stand more straight, will take up more space, will have more direct eye contact, and will have will have more confident voice, that sort of thing, relative to the person who has less power. However, if you look at a leader, say, in China versus a leader in America, you will see differences in how much space they take, or, that sort of thing. So I would say, yes, it's true within a culture, but there are cultural differences across cultures. Yes?
Oh, thank you. Matthew Daines, I'm the University of California guy here in London. I was thinking about Margaret Thatcher because the two leadership
Yes.
figures in the popular imagination here in the UK have been, in the last couple of months, have been Margaret Thatcher because she died, who was arguably more male than any of the men in her cabinet. And also, interestingly, and this is more in the popular sphere, Alex Ferguson and his management of his soccer team. So I was wondering if you could reflect upon those. And also, it seems to me that part of what you're talking about is with Dean Lyons, the T-bar, the T-bone thing, and that it seems to be part of that paradigm.
Yes.
So that's my observation.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the whole thing about awareness, self-awareness, is definitely the breadth of the leader and understanding how they fit in different situations. Margaret Thatcher, when I talk about my research, people do talk about Margaret Thatcher, but the thing is, I think she's pretty unique. I don't know that we can draw many lessons from her because she doesn't strike me as she's not a stereotype of anything, really. I mean, she's basically a woman who, as you said, was more male than some of the men on her. I mean, she came across as just no nonsense, unwilling to, so if I go back to these stereotypes, you didn't really sense any of the kindness, warmth, sympathy, She was totally on the agentic side. Oh, okay, so in her personal life. But in terms of her public image, it was very much on the agentic side. But I think there's a generational issue here as well. So I've talked to women who sort of the generation above me who felt that when they were rising up through, especially like the financial industry, they had to act male. They wouldn't be accepted unless they were accepted as one of the boys. So it may, I think, reflect the generation that she grew up in. Whereas nowadays, I see a lot of women who feel that they don't need to do that anymore, depending on the industry.